Hello, everybody, and welcome to Penguins to Go, your daily dose of Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcasts from. The first day of training camp for the Penguins has now come and gone, and the season is officially underway. Some early surprises on the first day of camp. Jake Guentzel skates before practice. We get positive updates on him. Still expected, as Mike Sullivan said after practice, to miss around the 5-game mark like Kyle Dubas had estimated at the initial stage of the injury about 6 weeks ago. So still expected to miss 6 games, but good to see Guentzel back on the ice before the first day of training camp. Also, Mark Pysyk had some time with Erik Karlsson on the ice during the scrimmage. That was a nice surprise, but through all the chaos, what I wanted to touch on, because there's a lot of things from yesterday that you take with a grain of salt. I mean, a lot of things, most of the things you saw yesterday, you take with a grain of salt. It's this coach's first chance to put these players on the ice and see what they look like in person in an organized team activity, in a scrimmage. Team 1 versus Team 2. Evgeny Malkin's team gets the win 3-1. But through all the chaos from yesterday, the early forming of this team started to begin. I want to preface this with Mike Sullivan's quote following practice. Quote, "Don't read too much into the lines." That's a fair statement. It's a fair statement, especially when you see, Vinny Hinostroza gets the first shot at playing with Sidney Crosby and Brian Rust. Rickard Rakell plays on what could be considered the early formation of the third line. And that's what I want to talk about here. There are a few combinations that played together yesterday because we know Mike Sullivan likes to do things in duos, specifically for his forward line. There are duos they likes to put together and get their chemistry going and then introduce the third player to kind of try to bring it all together. Ryan Graves working with Chris Letang. That's a duo. Riley Smith working with Evgeny Malkin. That's a duo you might see on October 10th. And Lars Eller working with Drew O'Connor. That's the one that intrigues me because, again, things could change. Over the next 2 weeks during training camp, a lot of things could change. But Lars Eller working with Drew O'Connor feels like something that we looked at before training camp opened and said, that's a really good possibility. Drew O'Connor returns on a multi-year deal. He returns after looking very impressive throughout last season. He continues to build and progress in his career. 46 games played last season for the Penguins. Performed well both in the NHL and in the AHL last season. He's a player that plays the way that Mike Sullivan likes to see players play. That was a tongue twister. Regardless, he plays the way that Mike Sullivan likes to deploy his bottom six forwards. And he showed in World Championships that he has a little bit of a scoring touch to him, more than he's shown at the NHL level. So yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense to see Lars Eller and Drew O'Connor working together. Eller enters his first camp with the Pittsburgh Penguins, signed a 2-year, $2.45 million contract on the opening day of free agency. And it's been mentioned, both by Kyle Dubas and by Eller himself, that he was essentially brought in to be the Penguins' third-line center. So there is a lot of competition in the Penguins training camp, but it seems as if as long as Eller doesn't fall off the face of the earth, he's probably going to slot in as the third-line center against the Blackhawks on October 10th. He's the poster child for what the Penguins wanted to add this offseason in the bottom six. Two-way forward, above-average foot speed, and some scoring touch. But more specifically, and more importantly, a defensive-first mindset. And that's what Eller brings. He's a guy that's going to play on the penalty kill. He's a guy that could potentially play on second power play unit if need be. He's really just the mold of a third-line center that the Pittsburgh Penguins were looking for. The question entering camp was, who's going to flank him on the third line? Who's going to be to his left? Who's going to be to his right? On the first day, like I mentioned, it was Drew O'Connor to his left. It was Rickard Rakell to his right. And like Mike Sullivan said, I know there's a lot of people that love Rickard Rakell that listen to the show. Mike Sullivan said, these lines are different because we had to move NHL talent around for competitive equality. I don't remember the exact quote that he used, but he wanted it to be competitively equal with NHLers to prospects on each team because the teams are split into 3. So during the first practice, it's O'Connor and Raquel. They get the first look together. Raquel, again, probably going to move up into the top 6. But O'Connor is a realistic option to start alongside Eller. Here's what Lars Eller had to say about his new line mate Drew O'Connor after practice.
And Drew, I wasn't really very familiar with, but I've been skating with him here most of August and in September, and I'm very, surprised because I don't feel like I played a lot against him, but he's a very good player. I'd like to see what we can do with him. I think he's got a lot of qualities, and he's seems like he's very willing to learn, listening, and we're communicating a lot. So he's an exciting player.
Now, if that is indeed the duo for the Penguins on the third line, that brings similar traits to the table: speed, forechecking, defensive awareness. While Raquel's not going to likely start there. Maybe he bounces down. We saw him play on the third line a little bit last year, but that was towards the end of the season when the third line really needed a spark. I would venture to guess you don't see Rickard Raquel starting on the third line. But he might be the archetype for the player they want on the right side because they have those two defensively minded forwards that bring a little bit of offense on the left and in the center. Potentially on the right, you look for a playmaking winger with the ability to finish. And the Penguins have a couple of those options in the lineup. They have a couple of those options on the training camp roster. Somebody like an Alex Nylander. Somebody like a Rem Pitlick. Somebody like an Andreas Johnsson would fit the bill. Regardless of who that ends up being, that is what it appears like, at least early on. Again, 2 weeks, things can change. It's the first day of training camp, so you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But seeing O'Connor and Lars Eller as a duo is something that, if they mesh well, could be the start of a good third line. I'm not going to say it's one of the best third lines in hockey because that would just be blatantly just hopeful, to be completely honest. But I think it's certainly much better than what the Penguins trotted out there last year on the third line and has the potential to be better and towards the top half of the NHL when it comes to third lines, and that is a massive improvement on what we saw last season. And on the right side, whether it's Nylander, whether it's Pitlick, whether it's Johnsson, it seems as if it's going to be that scoring winger that might have to sacrifice a little bit of defense considering the other two guys are so good in their own zone and so good for 200 feet. So that's what I'm looking for. That's one of my main takeaways is that you're starting to see the building blocks. It's the first block laid down. It's the base being laid down by Mike Sullivan to try to build this roster, to try to build chemistry for the Pittsburgh Penguins. There's a long road ahead. 2 weeks and then an 82-game season. So a lot changes throughout the course of those 6-7 months, but at least after day one, it looks like Drew O'Connor and Lars Eller might be a theme, at least early on in the season. At the very least, early on in training camp. So it's something to keep an eye on. The Penguins open their preseason schedule this Sunday in a split squad scrimmage against the Columbus Blue Jackets. All I'm saying, keep an eye out for these two and how they mesh in that game. That's going to do it for this episode of Penguins to Go. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcasts from.